Well, I mean, first and foremost, it's still considered an area of opportunity for people. There are always challenges in opportunities. Some perceive the CEE as a whole, everything's the same. But the more sophisticated investors know that isn't necessarily the case. There is a lot of diversity and variety within the region. Some of that is simple maturing of markets, who has been in the EU longer, notions like that. But again, it's not necessarily a negative or a positive. It can be both. It can be there are challenges, and it certainly as service providers it makes our life much more interesting. And I think even for an investor, the fact that investing in the CEE with some varieties among the markets actually gives you a bit of diversity within the market. And investing in the CEE certainly gives you diversity in your overall European portfolio. Do you agree with that, Horst?
Yeah, I do. I think in many respects it's still an emerging market, although it's maybe it's a simpler term to use for the large region because the countries are in different stages of development, and also the way the interesting to investors changes over the time. Obviously, Poland has remained a long-term star throughout today and benefits from that also due to its proximity to Germany and the massive German investments in this country. Other countries have had cycles, but you find good companies in each of those markets, and you have growth potential in all these markets. Some countries are affected by current politics in the way they can act or develop. An example is Hungary, which has a very sort of particular policy right now on government level. And you have heard examples of large funds coming into the region trying to buy significant assets, which is an interesting trend and certainly encouraging because it shows that the long-term story of the region having growth potential and being able to generate revenues from the perspective of a sophisticated investor is a good sign. Obviously, there are not going to be that many of that kind of investments, but it sets a mark and will trigger other investments.
I think it's in general, as some of our last panel actually was talking about, this is a region of the middle market. And there's nothing wrong with that. Good, steady middle market investment and opportunities are a good thing.
Yeah, there's a big transformation ongoing in the energy sector, mainly driven out of Germany, if one can say, due to the change to a high standard of renewable energy consumption, with a target for 2020 to be pretty much just be served by renewable energy sources. That, of course, has triggered a massive sale of other energy assets owned by the big German energy companies like E.ON and RWE. That has created sell-side work. A good example is the sale of Net4Gas in the Czech Republic, which was owned by RWE and then was sold to a consortium, including private equity. A very interesting infrastructure investment now. And you see, of course, another trend that is Russian companies trying to get a stronger foothold in Europe by buying energy assets. That's an ongoing wave. Of course, that's is limited because of public policy considerations in the EU to try to limit investments into the energy sector because of its dependence on Russian supplies at this time. But certainly it's going to continue, and we have a number of energy projects that are ongoing in the region, be it construction of power plants. There's also an interest in nuclear energy again, because not all countries want to get out of nuclear. And you see other examples like Enel wanting to sell energy assets in Slovakia and in Romania. That again creates a real sale process and a multi-billion-dollar, type of transaction.
Well, I mean, I see actually the Net4Gas as an example of CEE countries reaching out beyond their borders. I mean, we've had lots of discussions here today about actually CEE countries going international, but I think clearly you'll see CEE participants participating more in the region. That is a clear trend.
Yeah. Financial services is a hot sector. It has created an enormous boom for the region over the last 15 years. The region has a couple of very large banks, 3 or 4 major groups. all these groups have had a tough time going through the financial crisis, and Europe-wide there's a stress test organized by the EU that's ongoing, and the outcome of that stress test will prove what strength from a regulatory capital perspective those banks have, and that strength will then trigger or not transactions. It could be further consolidation because a bank is seen as not strong enough, but it could also mean that the bank is coming out safe and strong and now wants to use the opportunity to further expand after some time of uncertainty.
Yeah. And I think it goes beyond banking. Insurance is another area that's really ripe for rationalization and consolidation. We saw a lot of that starting in Ukraine last year. It's been put on hold a little bit by the current situations, but I think you'll also see that throughout the CEE. Insurance companies getting bigger.
Yeah, it's still so that our companies in the region would primarily go to the banks to get money. It's gotten much harder to get money. The loan covenants have become stricter. The risk perspective of the banks has become significantly stricter because it's all now rooted to the capital of the bank, and very strong tests on whether borrowing or lending decisions were made in the right way. So banks are not as easily giving money out. That again means that some companies have to get new financing. Sometimes they're able to with other banks because there's a diversification. Sometimes they're not able to, then they have to sell assets to raise cash. And another avenue that we have seen is raising money on the debt markets by doing bond issuances in the global markets. For that you need to be big enough, but we have seen this out of Croatia, out of Poland, and we expect this to be a trend.
It's challenging. I mean, there's no doubt that it's challenging. You have to really work at it. But there are alternatives to bank financing. Well, we certainly expect to see a lot more activity. I mean, some of this is a function of government spending less on health care and people having to look for alternatives. It's really very much a worldwide trend, maybe starting and coming strongly from the U.S., but we expect to see a lot more activity.
Yeah, certainly, because when you compare the healthcare costs per person in Europe or in the US to the costs in this part of the world, you see there's an enormous potential to increase the level of services and coverage of the population, and the governments won't be able to do this so quickly for such a large amount of people. And so you will have private health services through hospitals, laboratories, and that trend will strongly continue, and we see that all the time in all the markets.
And I think the insurance companies will have roles in that. This is a growth market for them too.